Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eaterberg, and today I'm bringing you an author interview with Ian Nathan, author of the forthcoming book, David Lynch, A Retrospective. Before I jump into the interview, please make sure you're subscribed to the show in your podcast player so you can get all the newest episodes as soon as they're released. If you like the interview and want to hear more, please consider leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Ian Nathan joins me once again today as my first returning guest on the Oscar Project Podcast. When we talked over the summer about his Clint Eastwood book, he mentioned the next project he had coming out, and is here today to discuss that forthcoming book, David Lynch, A Retrospective, which arrives November 7th. Ian, welcome back to the show. It's great to speak with you again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, and it's an honor to be the first returning guest to your show.
Absolutely. Now, one of the questions I asked you when you were on talking about Clint Eastwood was about his connection between jazz and his films. And Lynch seems to have a similar focus on film and art, and oftentimes even film as art. How do you think things like painting and sculpture have informed Lynch's films over the years?
Well, I think in simple terms, if you were asking this question of David Lynch, he would say they were all the same thing. They were just sort of extensions of one another. The famous story is that the reason he even got into filmmaking was that he was painting, he was at art college in Philadelphia. And he had this kind of idea, he had this kind of feeling about a wind, these kind of very Lynchian kind of images. And he wanted his painting to move. He wanted a moving painting. So he started to explore that as an artistic expression. He incorporated visual elements into his paintings that were moving, animation, sort of elements that would extend beyond the static canvas into a living format. And that grew finally into filmmaking itself, that he realized that he would be able to express those artistic desires, the kind of the muse that he had best or most distinctively if he had a full-scale moving picture to do it with. And that became film. Starts with Eraserhead, but he would tell you that every one of his films has carried on that very idea. So indeed, his films are paintings and they are sculptures. And he makes a lot of props and elements for his films as well, and certainly the early ones. And I still think he, visually, he sees himself as a painter. And of course, anyone who follows online and, in terms of exhibitions, what David Lynch does, he still paints, he still sculpts, he still is very much the artist away from filmmaking. And I think for him, it's just one fluid form of expression.
For sure. Now, you mentioned it a moment ago, and the book takes Lynch's films roughly in chronological order, starting obviously with Eraserhead, which I think you call the source code for everything else he's made. How did that film help establish his methods and his style of film?
I think what Eraserhead did for him was show him the way he could make sense of the images in his head. And in some ways, even though it was made on a microscopic budget and it took something like 4 years to finish and really took the help of friends and colleagues and was this kind of bizarre, long-winded journey in which he was virtually doing a few frames a day, it was the best experience of his career, certainly in terms of film, because he had the utmost control over it. He was down there, he was, as I sort of said, he's sculpting props and images. He was setting the scene up exactly how he wanted it. And I think what Eraserhead gives him, certainly on a kind of technical level, is this idea of what he would need to manage across a production to express the things he wanted to express. To tell a David Lynchian story, he would need this kind of utmost control. In fact, that's one of the dilemmas that comes up with the films you might say didn't work as well for him, his dalliances in Hollywood, because he wasn't able to have that kind of utmost control. It's not really even auteur theory, it's beyond that. It's a sense of absolutely pouring what was in his mind straight out into the film. But also Eraserhead sets up so many of the themes and character styles and the overall kind of gothic mood of the Lynchian work. It's set in a slightly alternate universe. It's a weird kind of nightmare cityscape. It's filmed in Los Angeles, but was largely based on his experiences living very poorly in Philadelphia while he was at art school. Those things were mixed together. And that idea of cities as sort of mental spaces arises in Eraserhead. And of course, the film is a riddle. It's about an incredibly anxious character who is a cipher for Lynch himself, coming to terms with a kind of child he's fathered, and all the kind of strange angst and the way that echoes outwards into dreams really sort of sets the mold or the style of what we think of as Lynchian.
Right, and you've used the term Lynchian several times already here, and you use it throughout the book to describe his style. And of course, I was surprised to see at the end of the book you left it as a little bit of a cliffhanger as to the true meaning of that word. But what do you think that word Lynchian means, and how do you know when something deserves to be called Lynchian?
Well, you happen upon the kind of the central sort of quest of the film, of the book, and the thing I set out to do, and the hardest thing of all to describe, is what is Lynchian? What is his work? It's many things, and it's things I probably couldn't describe. I think it was described by one critic. I use this quote that is impossible to put down in words, but you know it when you see it.
Sure.
There are elements of film noir. There are elements of horror. There are sort of elements of his background in painting and surrealism, his desire to use dream logic as maybe the biggest brushstroke he has. There is a determination to set up riddles and puzzles for the viewer and not interpret them and not give an answer to them, because he wants the viewer to have their own interpretations. His argument is that if he tells you what he thinks Eraserhead means, or what Blue Velvet ultimately means, or what Mulholland Drive works out to be, he would end the debate over his films. He'd bring a halt to what we think of, or our own processes of interpretation, because that's the most important thing in the Lynchian world. Is it's not the answer, it's the questioning. It's our own journey within those films.
Sure.
And I think that's what ultimately Lynchian is. It's the unanswered questions. And of course, within that, there's wonderful things you can look at and test and decipher and conclude. And that's one of the joys. I mean, I say in my introduction that I'm not setting out to figure out David Lynch, but you can't help but try, because that's what the films do to you. And I think that's the true nature of Lynchian is it's the unknowability of life, but it's asking the question all the same.
Sure, makes sense. And now, in your chapter about Blue Velvet, you compared Lynch a little bit to Hitchcock in that they both kind of emphasize that aspect of cinema that where we, the audience, want to watch others enact some of our darkest desires. How do you see that as an essential part of what Lynch does in his films?
Well, yes. If you think of Alfred Hitchcock, and as an aside, I would say that as strange and surreal as many of Lynch's films are, he's very influenced by classical Hollywood. He does love, the great films of the 40s and 50s, and he invests his films with what you might think of as classical tradition. So he just sort of then plays around with them. So Hitchcock would be a natural sort of touchstone for him. And Hitchcock, of course, wanted to take cinema to an extreme place. He wanted to make films that almost interpret what films might be and why, and how we watch films. And this sort of reaches its apotheosis, I think, with Rear Window, when you have James Stewart's character, basically housebound because he's broken his leg. So the leading man can only watch what goes on in the film. He can't take part in it. Right. So he reminds us as the watcher that we're watching the film. And if you jump to Lynch, he does this a lot. He, as the characters, observe rather than take part. I mean, the most dramatic example is Carl MacLachlan's character in Blue Velvet, locked away in the cupboard and just observing what's going on in the scene through the slats, the light pouring on his face, this kind of bizarre and shocking moment. Isabella Rossellini and Dennis Hopper enact in front of him a sort of pseudo-sexual sequence that's nightmarish. But the point of the scene for Lynch is us watching someone watch it happen. And it falls back on us to wonder about what we want from films. Why do we watch them? And here's one of the great pleasures in movies and movie watching, this idea that what we get to do is watch people enact our dark secrets, that we get to see our deepest fantasies up there without having to admit them to anybody. And, a lot of what goes on within us, and this is a classic Lynchian idea, is both good and bad together, that we're not just one thing, that we all have our dark sides. And I think that's what he's sort of honing in on. And that's similar very much to what Hitchcock wants to suggest as well.
Right. And now you mentioned at one point in the book that Lynch is as puzzled by himself as anyone else might be. What is it about him that's so puzzling, and why do you think even he can't explain himself?
I think he enjoys this idea as a creative, as a person, as an artist, of trying to get something out onto a painting, into a sculpture, into a film that is almost eliminates the mediation of the intellect. That's kind of ultimately impossible, but in some ways what he wants is to kind of unopen the unconscious and let it out and see what that might be. You think of Inland Empire, it's a film where he sort of made it up almost as he went along, shooting over a long period of time with digital cameras, because that got him as close as possible to not having the mediation of a screenplay and a production and expectations of a studio. The kind of tenets of storytelling were almost removed. And I think what he likes is this idea that he doesn't know exactly what film he's making.
Right.
He doesn't know why these things are like they are, but he loves that journey you go on with those images. And Twin Peaks, is a sort of great example of setting something up in a very formal tradition, the whodunit,
Mm-hmm.
which has a very precise set of rules, and then throwing those rules out the window, even though the audience sort of still hold on to them and hope they work out, and then just letting it go where it will and following the mystery. So when he says he makes mystery stories, I think part of that is that the mystery is to himself. He doesn't know where they're going to end up. He doesn't know the end of his film at the beginning. He may have an idea, but he doesn't quite know. And again, it sort of comes back to that idea of what is Lynchian. And I think it's about sort of that exploration is the key movement through a film, that maybe his weaker films are the most plotted, and his stronger films, certainly from his own point of view, are the ones that make the least sense.
Right.
So it is a mystery. And he, would say, I don't know what this film is about. You tell me.
Now, several times in the book, you mention how almost enjoyable or relaxed things are on his sets, even though a lot of his subject matter is quite the opposite. How do you think he can go about creating that sense of security and comfort on the set while doing some, very tough subject matter?
Well, I think, to me, one of the great triumphs of David Lynch's career is how he's got to a place where he's attained control and he can manage the entire production. And if you think about it, it's a very strange thing making a David Lynch film. Anyone who's sort of witnessed a movie set will know that they're almost kind of industrial-like enterprises. Even if it's a small film, a lot of people are involved, a lot of different sort of trades come together with different needs, all under the management of a director. But to get an entire crew on something of the scale of Mulholland Drive or Blue Velvet, or even Straight Story, to do not only what the script says, but absolutely come up with the images you want on the screen and singular to your imagination as a director, is a remarkable achievement. And to do that, I think he has to have every member of his crew sign up to what his expectations might be. He doesn't encourage huge amounts of debate among actors. I think he likes them to do his bidding. You have to follow the Lynchian method, otherwise it won't work out. I think that's sometimes why he doesn't return to certain actors who might be a bit questioning, like Nicolas Cage. And that's a remarkable thing. But I think as part of that, on set, he requires a certain kind of civility and a calm. He likes quiet himself. He likes a kind of peacefulness. So even though his scenes have these kind of wild, violent moments in them, and often very shocking, sequences right across his films, it's actually the making of them is quite tranquil almost. It's the David Lynch way.
Right. Now, as with the Eastwood book, you had a number of references at the end of this book, but were there any specific books or articles or other material folks should check out if they enjoyed yours and want to learn even more about Lynch?
Well, I think more than any book I've written, going into this, and it was an intimidating idea to write a book about David Lynch. It's a complicated world. And one of the things I was a little bit in awe of was just how remarkable the writing on Lynch has been. There has just been some tremendous interpretation and appreciation of his work right across. He seems to draw very in-depth articles out of critics. One of the key pieces for me is, in fact, an essay rather than a full book by David Foster Wallace, who was one of the very lucky people to be allowed onto a Lynch set. Lynch doesn't like journalists being on his sets. He doesn't like interference, for the reasons we spoke about. Mm-hmm. But David Foster Wallace was allowed on to the making of Lost Highway. And his piece, which expands out from Lost Highway to explore all the different facets of Lynch, but really centers on this idea of what is David Lynch like as a director? What is he like when you look at him make films? I think it was an absolutely vivid and exciting piece for me. I went back to it a lot as a guide. It's in a collection called A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again. It's one of the essays in that collection of essays. A terrific piece of writing, and just a wonderful, it doesn't have any answers in it, but it's a wonderful way of exploring the world of David Lynch. And I took that as a great inspiration.
Now, I have a couple of questions not specifically related to the book, but before I move on to those, is there anything else you want to touch on about the book or about Lynch?
No. I think it's, as I say, it was an incredible sort of texture to enter into. It's a very different book from any I've written in the past because of Lynch himself. The structure is film by film, which is similar to Clint Eastwood and the many books I've written, but it presented a different kind of thinking and writing to me. That it wasn't simply a case of how was the production put together, what were the trials in the making of each film. Those things came into it, but it was about kind of what's going on in David Lynch's head at this point in time, each time you enter into a film. Yeah. So it felt a little bit like I was sort of swimming around or sort of cast adrift at times in Lynch's imagination. And, at times I felt lost and a bit daunted and a bit like, will I ever get this under control? But it came out okay, I think. And I think it's, again, a little bit like the Lynchian method. It's sort of the journey that matters here. It's the journey I took rather than maybe the precise, conclusions I come to.
Sure. Well, I certainly enjoyed it and enjoyed learning quite a bit about Lynch himself. Now, since I asked you last time about your favorite films, I'm going to change the question up a little bit. What are 3 films that you find yourself coming back to again and again? They don't necessarily have to be favorites, but ones that you may revisit regularly.
I thought about this question, and it's quite a hard one because in some ways the films you return to are your favourites. They're the ones that draw you back and the things in them. I think we may have spoke about Miller's Crossing last time, but it is a film I repeatedly view. Something about its texture and its screenplay, its language draws me in. But this year alone, partly because I'm writing about this world, I've watched Fury Road 5 times, Mad Max Fury Road. And every time I've watched it, I've seen different things within it. And not just different sort of action beats and moments and details, sort of different ways of looking at it. And I think it's a remarkable kind of almost punk rock piece of filmmaking amid the boring formality that Hollywood often delivers in the guise of action movies. You feel more alive when you finish watching Fury Road. You just feel kind of energized. And it's a great feeling to come back to, or to get from it. And in complete contrast, because it's also a little bit of a film I'm sort of working on, but for a different thing, is A Brief Encounter. It's David Lynch's wonderful romance, and one of the films that sort of precede his great sort of epics, Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge on the River Kwai and Dr. Zhivago, those films I think he's most remembered for. But Brief Encounter is an unrequited love story about two people who meet on a train is delayed and they meet on a railway platform. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. And it's a wonderful study of the workings of the human heart. And I think Lynch would probably look at Brief Encounter and get a lot out of it because, it's about the unknowable in a sense, and the things we do to our lives that can be devastating. And I find that extraordinary.
Excellent. Now, last time I had you invite some movie characters to dinner, but this time I want to change it over to some real people. You've obviously written about many directors over the years. If you could invite a handful of actual directors, who would you bring to dinner with you?
So actual directors, they probably all start, fighting with one another and arguing, but that would probably be the joy of it.
Yeah.
The aforementioned Alfred Hitchcock would have to be one of those. Because of the things, he would bring. And you just think he would be really kind of cheeky fun as well.
Sure.
I would love, again, he's not a director, but it's like sometimes you get asked that question, who would you bring back to life if you could? And I always say John Candy, because I think the world was a better place with John Candy in it. And I would love to have John Candy, just making his grin around my dinner table. But I might need someone different because that's two kind of large, funny guys already sitting around my table. So maybe a different energy, another director perhaps. Who would I also want around the table? I wouldn't maybe go for Lynch because he's a bit shy and remote, and we can get sort of teasings out of him. But one of the greats of the 70s, maybe a Scorsese or a Spielberg, just a sort of. If you have a Spielberg, he would appreciate what the other two were bringing to the table, and he would sort of bridge the gap, I think, between them. He would know all about John Candy, and he would know all about Alfred Hitchcock, and he would kind of make that work, I think.
Yep, I think that would be an excellent dinner. I'd like to attend that one. Now, as before, I asked if you had any books that you could recommend that you've been reading recently. So anything new that you're reading, fiction, nonfiction, and again, doesn't necessarily have to be about movies.
I read a lot, and often, I think of reading as a kind of workout. If you're a writer, you have to kind of exercise your talents and abilities, and you do it by reading. And sometimes you can read people who are so good that you end up intimidated and depressed and angered because you went up to reach those heights. I'm reading a very good book about the director Fassbinder, the German director, who I knew very little about. It's I think it's called like Fassbinder in 1,000 Mirrors or words to that effect. I haven't got it beside me at this point. But it's by a man called Ian Penman, who is a music critic, but is a huge fan of Fassbinder. And it's almost like a sort of philosophical tract. He sort of draws upon the life and work of Fassbinder and spills out into a interpretation of his own life and this creative life and depiction of Germany in the 1970s and sort of growing up in the shadow of World War II. And I just found it sort of absolutely mesmerizing to read and to sort of journey along with it. I've also been reading again, really because I wanted inspiration, a collection of new journalism edited by the late Tom Wolfe. And it's just a wonderful, really it's a book of essays, but it's a wonderful collection of where journalism could go to in the 60s and 70s, and what you could do with the mere structure of an interview or the political piece and the textures you could throw into that. I find it very inspiring. The pieces about Vietnam by Michael Hare, there's essays by Joan Didion, and essays by Hunter S. Thompson. So wildly different kind of things. Tom Wolfe himself is represented. Norman Mailer is in there. But I've really kind of gone back to it because there are just kind of techniques I've seen in it, shorthand things and clever ways of interpreting things that have been an absolute godsend to me.
Excellent. I'll be sure to put some links to those things in there. And before we wrap up, we've covered your two most recent books on the podcast in the last couple of months, but are you taking a break, or do you have something else lined up for us coming up next?
Well, work never seems to stop, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. I'm currently editing a documentary on the film Aliens, the sequel to Alien. I've interviewed numerous members of the cast and crew, and it's been a good discipline, actually. There's a similarity to books, but there's different challenges, using the image rather than the written word. But I've really enjoyed that journey. And as I hinted at, I'm writing a book about the history of the Mad Max films at the moment, and very different from David Lynch, but in its own way, a very strange world. And I'm just bringing that to a conclusion. Then I might take a couple of weeks off, but there are some plans brewing on the horizon as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to hearing about the documentary and about the Mad Max book at some point in the future. Well, thank you so much, Ian. I really appreciated you taking the time to speak with me again today, and hope that we can have you on in the future for whatever the next project is.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you again to my guest today, Ian Nathan. His newest book, David Lynch, A Retrospective, is out November 7th, and I'll have a link to where you can pick that up in the show notes, along with links to movies and books mentioned throughout the interview. The Oscar Project podcast is written and produced by me, Jonathan Eaterberg, with editing assistance from Joshua Eaterberg. Please come back for my next episode, where I will be speaking with Nate Patron about his upcoming book, The Needle and the Lens. Until then, I hope to see you at the movies.